Ooh. Hello, YouTubers! My name is Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have reaction request 119, The Beast Arises Part 2. This is part of Arch Warhammer's The Beast Arises lore series and has been requested by CJ Falcon. So let's check it out. Ready and play.
Greetings, salutations, friends, and welcome back to the second lore breakdown for the Beast Arises series. Last time, when we left the Imperial Fences on Adamantua, they had encountered considerable amount of orcs. Not just any type of orcs, these were rather
Super
special orcs. They were far bigger and apparently considerably brighter than the usual green-skinned rabble that the Imperial Guard was fighting in the outer reaches of the Imperium. Oh, and of course there's the small matter of the fucking moon they managed to teleport into orbit.
Yeah.
Their newfound technological powers notwithstanding, however, the orcs were still at heart
I gotta
orcs,
keep referencing
which was
it.
represented quite handily by the water world of Undine. The planet was almost entirely covered in water, with only a handful of Imperial hive cities reaching out above the waves. The overwhelming majority of the population lived on ramshackable fleet cities, which essentially made up the underhive of this particular planet. Its primary defense was the Undine Navy rather than the Imperial Guard. In fact, the only real Imperial Guard presence were the Undine Mariners. And one might expect that the orcs, with their newfound wisdom, would recognize this, and therefore not drop directly into the fucking sea, but no, they are still orcs, and the overwhelming majority of the orc invasion force simply plummeted directly into the goddamn ocean.
Wow!
The sheer badassery of these new orcs protected them from a watery grave, or, well, protected at least a fair few of them who simply just wandered out of the ocean and onto the hive cities, but still,
nice.
The fact that the orcs were more than willing to simply just dump their troops directly into a goddamn planet-spanning ocean is a pretty good indication that they might have gotten smarter, their technology might have gotten better, and their strategy has certainly evolved, but they're still orcs. Despite the somewhat lacking manner of their arrival, however, there were still way too many big orcs for the planet of Undine to resist, and the planet's primary hive was quickly overrun. The remainder of Undine's navy was able to escape, however, primarily because, well, the orcs weren't really expecting to deal with the navy. In fact, it would appear that they hadn't the faintest fucking clue that the planet they were attacking was primarily consisting of chemical water. Nevertheless, the orcs are remarkably quick to adapt, so the planet was not entirely out of the woods yet. Especially with the orcs' new weapon, the so-called attack moons. Now, firstly, and most obviously, they are gargantuan carrier crafts, storing entire armadas of smaller ships, not to mention countless numbers of fighter bombers and, well, what passes for orc fighter bombers anyways, along with massive numbers of orcs and armored vehicles, along with all of the necessary supplies to keep an orc army going. And of course there is the small matter of what happens to a planet if you dump a goddamn moon directly into its orbit. The gravitational disturbances seen on Adamantua is simply one of the many naughty side effects of dumping something that big into near orbit of a planet. Massive natural, or well in this case unnatural disasters like huge earthquakes and gargantuan typhoons would sweep almost the entire planet's surface. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that more people are likely to die from that than they are to die from the orcs. Not that the orcs won't be trying, mind you, just that the natural disasters will probably get to the people quicker. And of course, let us not neglect the psychological effect upon a planet's population when a massive armoured space moon looking like an orc face suddenly pops into near orbit and starts to tear the planet apart with gravitic weaponry and tectonic activity, and then starts dropping millions upon millions of angry greenskins on top of them. And while, yes, true, a lot of the orcs are going to die in the ensuing natural disasters, but they're fucking orcs. One, they have a hell of a lot higher of a chance of surviving any natural disaster than a human does, and two, they flat out don't give a shit. And speaking of attack moons, I do feel I should touch a little bit upon this. So, the whole attack moon teleportation thing should just flat out not be possible within Warhammer 40k. There is virtually no record of something of this size being teleported, and most certainly not something built by orcs. It seems unlikely. I'm interested in seeing where they're going to go with this in the book series, because if this is just a plain old-fashioned warp tunnel, I would probably be calling bullshit, simply because you would need a massive Geller field to have even the vaguest hope of moving this thing. And without the Geller field, I mean, the orcs might have a lot of fun with the demons, but there are limits to what even the orcs can handle. And there is no mention so far of a Geller field. There is a mention of a warp effect, as it did create a warp gate, which also doesn't really fit in with how normal webway technology works. It doesn't create just a huge-ass gate, and the gate mentioned in the first book also just kinda isn't mentioned again, so exactly how this moon works, I haven't the faintest. I'm interested in seeing if they're going to be explaining that at any point, or if it's just going to be one of those it's just fucking magic things, which I really do despise. Regardless of whether or not it's going to be it's just fucking magic, or I get an actual explanation, what we do know is that they were pretty goddamn effective. The only worlds that were having any real success in holding off the orcs were worlds like Undine, or far more extreme worlds like Death Worlds, or, Space Marine home worlds. One of these worlds, for example, was occupied by the Fist Exemplars, and their grounded fortress monastery. Now, normally this massive fortress monastery was supposed to be a spaceborne thing, and pretty damn huge in and of itself, although still only like a third of even the smaller attack moons, but still a significant gathering of boom and bang. However, during a temporary move of the space fortress near the warp anomaly that the Fist Exemplars had been created to guard, the warp anomaly did what warp anomalies do. It anomalized, and did something that nobody expected. The blast of ethereal energy that escaped from the warp pushed the massive space fortress off course, trapping it in the gravity well of a nearby planet, forcing the fortress monastery to crash land on the planet. Now, the fact that the fortress monastery is even intact after that shows how masterfully the Fist's Exemplar actually handled the situation, and speaks volumes of what an absolute badass the captain of that thing was. However, it was now a space monastery on a planet, and it was currently under attack by orcs. Now, granted, it still had a fuck ton of weaponry on it, but it was all the kind of weaponry that would normally have been used for point defense. Granted, point defense weaponry on a space monastery is still Titan-level weaponry on the ground, but it would probably have inflicted far more damage upon the adorable little orky-borkies in space. But hey, it's not like it was going to be lifting up anytime soon, so the Fist Exemplars would have to make do with what they were given. And much like their Imperial Fist's brothers, the Exemplars also made the mistake of underestimating the greenskin. Once the orcs landed upon their planet, the Fist Exemplars assumed that they would be using their massive landing fortresses, their rooks, as bases of operation from which to launch further offensives. As such, they mobilized practically everything in the First Company and everything that could roll in the fortress's armoring, and rushed out to meet the enemy in an armored spearhead. The plan was to destroy the rooks, therefore denying the enemy the ability to send reinforcements to the planet via the teleporters that often exist on such rooks. Unfortunately for the Fist Exemplar, there were a hell of a lot more orcs and a hell of a lot more rooks. What the Fist Exemplar thought to be the entire invasion was merely the scouting troop. and the Exemplar's armoured columns were caught outside when it started pouring greenskins and gigantic fucking asteroids from the skies. Unsurprisingly, this was a bit of a problem. Luckily, however, the 5th Exemplars had not gone complete Allahu Akbar and charged out against the enemy. They had left behind a garrison force to hold their stranded space monastery, which was damn lucky as well, seeing as now the armoured spearhead and the greater might of the chapter was caught outside of the space monastery, surrounded by millions upon millions of Orkies, while their beloved fortress was under siege by further millions upon millions of Orcs. On the upside, the 5th Exemplars were, as their name suggests, a successor chapter of the Imperial Fists, and as such they were pretty damn good at holding fortifications, and a gargantuan space fortress monastery of doom, death, and boom is most definitively a pretty damn good fortification. Even so, however, despite the fortress monastery's Titan-grade weapons, despite several hundred battle brothers standing upon its rampart hammering bolt fire directly into the enemy horde, there was simply just too many fucking Orcs. They quite literally overwhelmed the monastery's defenders and managed to force their way onto the battlements through sheer force of numbers, until the fortress monastery's guns were no longer capable of firing upon the enemy for fear of hitting their Adeptus Astartes brethren. And due to the intensity of the combat, there was no way that their forces on the battlements could be resupplied effectively, which essentially meant that each battle brother was reduced to whatever ammunition he had at hand before he had to resort to his close quarters weapons to defeat a bajillion Orcs. To put it bluntly, things did not look particularly rosy for the 5th Exemplars. However, a bright young captain put in charge of the defences had a, insane idea. He ordered the fortress monastery's massive engines to be fired once more. Now, at this point, the gargantuan engines were buried in the soil of the planet. They were literally covered by hundreds of tons of sand. And as you can probably imagine, firing engines designed to push a structure weighing several 100,000 tons through space directly into the ground is going to have some uncomfortable side effects. It was, however, one of these side effects that was going to save the 5th Exemplar. The space monastery began to incline. The Adeptus Astartes could simply maglock their boots to the hull of the starship, but the Orcs had no such luxury and began sliding off the hull, giving the Astartes a considerable advantage, seeing as their enemies were now sprawled on all four, while the Astartes were still standing upright, wielding bolt weapons. It gave the Astartes the time and the advantage they needed to clear the rampart without further Orc reinforcements being able to force their way onto the walls, and give them enough time to resupply and re-engage the Orcs at range with a punishing barrage of bolter fire, and it also gave them enough space between themselves and the enemy to re-engage the fortress monastery's defensive weapons. And while, to be sure, it was a temporary measure, the 5th Exemplars had killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Orcs, but they were millions more in orbit. However, it did buy them just enough time for dawn to finally arrive. So far, the 5th Exemplar and the Orcs had been fighting at night. And when dawn finally rose on the embattled planet of Idolica, it brought with it the sunrise. And the local star which Idolica orbited was not of the gentle variety. The planet's surface was blasted with extreme heat and solar radiation to the point where even the Orc's enhanced physiology could not stand up to it. While an Orc, like the ones in these stories, is capable of surviving being set on fire by a flamer, because it simply just doesn't have any goddamn fucking pain receptors left, that was not a problem when it came to the star of Idolica. Because it did not set them on fire, it simply incinerated them. The Orcs might not be able to feel it, but that didn't matter much when they were reduced to a fine black pulvery dust. Inevitably, however, eventually, the planet of Idolica would once again turn its back to the sun, which would leave the 5th Exemplar at the mercy of the Orcs. And this time, the trick with tilting the fortress monastery was not going to be an option. Firing engines of that scale directly into the ground upon which the fortress rested was not the gentlest of ideas. And with the additional damage the fortress monastery originally took when it fell out of the goddamn sky, it was not in a state in which it could ever try that again without probably breaking in half. And of course there was the small matter of the Fists Exemplar's armoured spearhead that was stuck outside. It was assumed that the Adeptus Astartes would have gone to ground in the extensive tunnel systems crisscrossing the planet to protect themselves from the fierce heat of the Eidolican day. As such, they were likely to still be alive, plus Adeptus Astartes' power armor was capable of standing up to the radiation of its sun for a considerable amount of time. A Space Marine could expect to stay alive for several hours without any real worries. Not enough to survive a full day unprotected, but more than enough to get themselves into some form of safety underground. Still, whatever protection that was offered by the Eidolican sun would all go away once nightfall once again descended, and with night would come the orcs. And the Fist Exemplar had barely held on for day 1. It was looking mighty grim for day 2. Luckily for the Exemplars, their brethren in the Black Templars had received their distress signal and had come to pick up their brethren.
Ooh.
At first, the Fist Exemplar and their new Chapter Master Thane, having been recently elevated after the death of the original Chapter Master when he led the armoured spearhead out against the Orcs, was originally hesitant to accept the Black Templars' requests to evacuate the Fist Exemplar, but, well, the situation was, quite literally, hopeless.
Mighty
and it
grim.
was far better for a fighting force like the Fist Exemplar to get the fuck out of Dodge and fight against somewhere else rather than simply just stand atop the fortress monastery, kill a few more million orcs, and then perish gloriously. The garrison of the fortress monastery, as well as the armoured company that had been launched against the orcs, were retrieved. Some casualties were inevitable as the Black Templars' fleet were holding off the orcs and engaging the attack moon above the planet, but all in all, something along the lines of half a chapter, along with most of its remaining armour, was rescued from the planet, a considerable fighting force. But enough of the trials and tribulations of the poor Astartes. It's time once again for a bit of politics. It is revealed that the Inquisition got their information about the impending Orc disaster through the Adeptus Mechanicus. Apparently, the Mechanicus had suspected this evolution of Orc kind for quite some time, and had even taken steps to prepare themselves against it. Part of that was to inform the Inquisition. However, they did not wish to reveal the full extent of the Orc threat, because they assumed the Orcs did not pose a direct threat to Mars. At the very least, not yet. But it most certainly posed a direct threat to the Imperium. And the Imperium and Mars was still somewhat of a fractious alliance. Ever since the Horus Heresy, the Mechanicus and the Imperium had not been the best of friends, and the Mechanicus tended to look to their own good before that of the greater Imperium. As such, it is not too strange that they would have chosen to keep this a secret, despite the appalling consequences. On the other hand, the Inquisition allowed themselves to be used in this way because they intended to cut out the fat from the High Lords of Terra. They, much like the Grand Master of the Officio, had seen the High Lords grow fat, worthless, and downright destructive to the Imperium. But they could not simply vote the High Lords out of power. They didn't have the political influence, and they most certainly could not get a vote of assassination through the High Lords. As you can probably expect, it's pretty damn hard to assassinate someone silently, quietly, and secretly when you first have to vote on that person's assassination right in fucking front of him. And so, as always, it was up to the Inquisition to find somewhat more subtle means to trim the fat of the Imperium's bureaucracy. And unsurprisingly, the Inquisition considered pretty much anyone that wasn't Inquisition to be fat. In the midst of all of these preceding intrigues, the Officio Assassinorum was getting sick and tired of being sidelined. The Officio's Grand Master realized that they needed a voice on the council to get anything done, and the way things were going at the moment, they really needed to start getting things done. But since the Officio had no way of getting onto the council, they would need to persuade somebody already on the council to speak for them. Unfortunately, the High Lords tend to be somewhat narrow-minded and stubborn individuals, all except for one. The current High Ecclesiarch was a fat and indulgent bastard that cared very little for his priestly calling, except, of course, for the privileges and benefits that such a position offered him. For example, he had a nasty habit of demanding some of the more attractive nuns join him for his nighttime prayer. On the upside, at least he isn't picking on the choir boys. Previously, the High Ecclesiarch was pretty much just a tool of Lansung, of the Imperial Navy, and the Lord Commander Macragge. For the Officio to use him for their purposes would require something quite other than the political power that they simply did not possess.
Yeah.
And while they knew plenty about his less priestly habits, the Grand Master of the Officio was not convinced that good old-fashioned blackmail would be enough, or at the very least not that kind of blackmail. And so the Grand Master took it upon himself to infiltrate the fat priest's abode and add a little bit of extra spice to his wine. And, by the way, while you might immediately think that this seems like a task somewhat beneath the Grand Master of the Officio, not to mention why the fuck would the Grand Master do this in the first place, there is actually a fairly good reason. Firstly, the Grand Master was known to the fat old priest. As such, his action would not expose any of his agents. And since the goal of the operation was to turn the High Ecclesiarch into a political puppet, rather than simply killing him, the assassin would inevitably have to reveal himself to instruct the High Ecclesiarch on what it is exactly he was expected to do. Additionally, it does occasionally pay off to scare the absolute living shit out of someone, and then be able to see them on a day-to-day basis. It helps to keep people honest. The Grand Master infiltrated rather effortlessly the High Ecclesiarch chambers, posing as one of the Ecclesiarch's favoured servants, one of his most trusted little slaves, one of the few people allowed in the room during nightly prayers, because that is a somewhat sensitive issue after all. As such, the slave in question was granted the honour of removing the High Ecclesiarch's garments, and specifically his priceless rings. This is important because one of the rings was a high-powered laser digiweapon, and seeing as the pudgy priest literally just handed it to the Grand Master, that was not something he had to worry about. After that, it was a simple matter of revealing himself to the Ecclesiarch and explaining to him exactly what he wanted done and the potentially lethal consequences. The Grand Master of the Officio explained to the High Ecclesiarch that he had put a particularly nasty poison in his evening wine, one that would not kill him immediately. In fact, it would take several days before the poison really began to work, and even when it began to work, it would take hours, maybe even days, before death was finally assured, which gives the Ecclesiarch all the time he needs to start doing the Officio's bidding, and also gives him a pretty damn nice incentive to do it. And while, of course, there was the possibility that the Officio was simply bluffing, as the Ecclesiarch himself pointed out, it wasn't a very likely one. And you can bet your shiny little ass that the High Ecclesiarch was not about to risk his fat little life on the gamble that it was a bluff. Furthermore, there was simply no way the High Ecclesiarch could tell anyone about this and be expected to be taken seriously ever again. Not only was he a High Lord of Terror, which naturally means that he is expected to have a bit of security behind him, but secondly, he was supposed to be protected by the Emperor. if it became public knowledge that the Grand Master of the Officio simply just wandered into his chambers and took his weapon out of his outstretched fucking hands. His power would be somewhat diminished, to put it bluntly. As such, the Grandmaster had committed the perfect crime because the victim simply could not tell anyone about it. There was, of course, the risk that he might call their bluff, although, bear in mind, it wasn't a bluff. The Grandmaster really had poisoned the fat old fool, and there was also the possibility that he would be able to identify the poison and get a hold of the antidote. Fat and incompetent he may be, but he is still a High Lord of Terra, which comes with a rather considerable amount of political and economical clout. Nevertheless, the poison didn't have to work particularly long. The Officio needed a temporary puppet, not a permanent one, and besides, acquiring a permanent puppet upon the council would be virtually impossible, considering the powers of even the least of the council members. And besides, if they'd gotten any of the other High Lords, there would always be the risk that they might find a quicker way of dispatching the Officio. It's a hell of a lot harder to pressure the Grand Lord of the Navy commanding fucking battleships, or the Grand Lord of the High Lords himself, the Lord Macragge, commanding entire armies. The High Ecclesiarch was the perfect blend of fat incompetence, usefulness, political power, and complete and utter impotence. Additionally, he could be counted on 100% to put his own self-preservation before any other concern, which is why the poison was such an effective means of leverage. And by the by, while all this was going on, the Officio Assassinarum was also busy creating and testing out various assassination scenarios against the High Lords, including the man currently in power, Lansung. In fact, we get to see, quote-unquote, or read about, to be specific, about one of these attempted assassination plans. It would take place at a gathering of Navy officers at the graduation ceremony for the best and the brightest of the naval colleges, in full view of thousands of officer cadets. During this event, the finest assassin of the Officio Assassinorum, one Esad Vire, also known as Beast Cruel, would simply run straight down the processional, directly at the High Lord Lansung, leap onto the podium and kill him with a single attack. And while this at first might seem insane, assassinate a guy at a gathering with thousands upon thousands of military personnel, you've got to remember, this was a ceremonial occasion, and weapons were not allowed in the presence of a High Lord. As such, the thousands upon thousands of naval people would be nothing but so much cover for the beast. They would not have any sort of weaponry. And the bodyguard of the High Lords, which were usually no more than 2 or 3 steps away from him, would not be allowed onto the main stage, which meant they would be a solid 30 to 50 meters away from their charge, giving a skilled assassin plenty of time to find an opening and to put down the fat admiral. In the end, though, such straightforward means of assassination was discarded, simply because it was impossible to know whether or not the High Lord of the Navy had some information and or knowledge about the Officio Assassinarum, its workings and its locations of strength, and, additionally of course, training compounds. It was suspected that if the High Lord had such knowledge, which was far from impossible considering he was a High Lord of Terra after all, then he might have put in place some form of contingency were he to be attacked by Officio personnel, which would order an Imperial Navy warships to bombard Officio locations, leading to the death of a lot of would-be assassins. As such, any assassination that would be obviously Officio was deemed too risky. Add to that, of course, the simple fact that the Grandmaster was not yet willing to take such drastic steps in his quest to rebalance the council. And now, we also get some really interesting information about the Orcs, which in many ways confirms what I've already been theorizing for, well, ages. Now, firstly, it is the nature of Orc weaponry and vehicles. I have myself hypothesized on several occasions that the reason why orc weaponry and vehicles even function, despite the fact that they simply should not function, is because of the Waaagh energy. Because of the psychic field, so to say, that orcs generate in large numbers. Essentially, they magic shit to work that otherwise just simply shouldn't work.
Just magic.
And this
the heck
is
out
shown
of it.
here in a really interesting little experiment back on Adamantium by the servants of the Mechanicus. A dead orc is located, and a broken orc weapon. Now, the weapon is irreversibly broken. It simply cannot function at this point. However, once the weapon is placed in the dead orc's hand, and power is fed to the weapon, it miraculously begins to function. And again, the only thing that was wrong with this weapon was not the fact that it didn't have any power, that it didn't have a battery. The chain of the weapon was so irreversibly stuck that it could not be pulled loose. Yet, the moment it is put in the dead orc's hand, somehow the chain manages to loosen itself and starts revving up again. And equally interestingly, once the hand is completely severed from the orc by several blows of a sharp weapon, the weapon instantly ceases to function again. The only conclusion to be had then is that the weapon was made to function by the orc itself, rather than the weapon simply just working on its own. It isn't simply the fact that the orcs know how to build crude yet effective weaponry, no. It is made to work by the orcs themselves and their connection to the warp. Essentially, they are bending reality in a limited form, and this effect apparently hangs around for quite a while after the orc is dead. This would seem to suggest that the orcs themselves generate a sort of warp field of sorts. Essentially, the orc is a walking warp rift. Now, obviously, it's not something so dramatic as a proper rift in the warp which lets demons flow out of it, but it would appear as if they are generating a field that actively weakens the barriers between the Immaterium and the real world, which makes it easier for them to work their orky-borky magic upon items, to put it bluntly. Therefore, it also seems logical to assume that the more orcs there are, the stronger this effect is. For example, if there's just one orc, maybe he couldn't have gotten the weapon to work. But if there were two orcs, maybe the weapon works then. Or perhaps it has something to do with the physical size of the orc. Perhaps the bigger the orc gets, the more powerful his warp field becomes.
Interesting.
We also get some interesting information about what passes for brains amongst the orcs. Generally speaking, in intelligent spacefaring creatures, you will see a significant development in parts of the frontal lobe of the brain, specifically the part that deals with intellectual discovery, innovation, logic, etc., problem solving. For example, the problem of how do we build a giant fucking rocket, and how do we make it carry people into outer space, stuff like that. For the orcs, however, there is no sign of development in the active part of the brain, the one that governs you when you're awake and makes you do things that aren't completely fucking ridiculous. In the orcs, however, their hindmost brain, their lower brain, seems to be responsible for a lot of their technological prowess. The centers that would normally determine such things are placed in the subconscious part of the orc mind. This seems to suggest that they have been engineered, since this simply has not happened so far as the Imperium knows anyways, in living history. The Imperium has not found a single species in which this is the case. Therefore, as far as the Imperium is concerned, it would appear to be an ironclad rule that any species that is capable of spacefaring technology has to be capable of logic and problem solving on an active level. However, with the orcs, that simply doesn't exist. All of it seems to be purely instinctive. And there are also clear signs of genetic manipulation. In other words, somebody built the orcs, and this is pretty much ironclad evidence of this. The Mechanicus also hypothesizes that to unlock this deeper knowledge, this instinctual knowledge, there needs to be a certain amount of orcs. Again, it seems to confirm the hypothesis that the more orcs gathered in one general area, the smarter the orcs get. Which means that it is essentially inevitable for the orcs to become very, very intelligent. Well, inevitable as in, you're going to have something that is actively killing off the orc population to prevent it. And orcs tend to be rather brutish beings, which means it is actually fairly rare to find something that is actively capable of killing orcs in large enough numbers to not only halt their technological progress, but reverse it. Or to put it simply, if there isn't an Imperium of man constantly torching the little fuckers, then eventually there will be enough spores spread across the planet, and enough of those spores will sprout into new greenskins to make the evolution of the greenskin species from a skin-wearing tribal society using spears and rocks to a spacefaring society essentially inevitable.
Huh.
The question then becomes, how far does it actually go? Is a spacefaring civilization the end of their evolutionary path? Well, clearly not, seeing as they've now developed fucking attack moons. So, is that the end of their evolutionary path? Almost complete control of the warp and gravity?
Advanced creatures.
Can they go further still? Because at the moment, as is demonstrated by the orcs plummeting into the chemical seas of Undine, the orcs are still orcs. The higher echelons of orc hierarchy, so to say, are clearly capable of far more complex strategies and planning than is usual, but the orcs grunt themselves, although being considerably bigger than normal, are still more than stupid enough to simply get shot directly down into a motherfucking ocean without really complaining about it. Speaking about complaining, by the way, it appears that the Imperial Fists were not completely wiped out, although pretty fucking close. A few Imperial Fists were found alive, 3 to be precise, by the Mechanicus exploration team that had gone down to Adamantua to dig through the remains. Along with the remains of the Magos biologist, who had been stuck with the expedition and had eventually decrypted the orcs' communication, quote-unquote, that was causing the gravitic disturbances. The Fists were in a critical state and near death, but kept alive in suspended animation. A feature of their Astartes biology, they were cocooned in a layer of, protective skin, essentially. Their Astartes physiology had grown a little cocoon, a membrane of sorts around them to protect them while their bodies tried to heal themselves. This is one of the ways that an Astartes can potentially survive in a vacuum, by the way, although not for an extended period. It's essentially a delaying tactic. The Astartes body is trying to delay the moment of death, hoping that somebody can come around and, stop them from dying.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for the Fists, however, the Adeptus Mechanicus were not that interested in returning them to Terra. Here's the thing. Back on Terra, there might still be experts in Astartes biology. They might even be able to come across a chapter apothecary, which often do go to Terra on pilgrimages. It's a bit of a long shot, but it would certainly be better. But there was just one teensy-weensy problem. First and foremost, the Mechanicus was not supposed to know about what had happened on Adamantua. And secondly, if they did know and they brought back 3 almost dead Imperial Fists, odds are pretty good that somebody would ask the unfortunate question, what the fuck were you doing there, and why the fuck didn't you help? Shits. And thirdly, you don't really want to be broadcasting that the entirety of the Imperial Fist chapter has been wiped out by goddamn orcs. It's not going to be very good for morale. And so instead, the Adeptus Mechanicus decided to play doctor and attempt to rescue the Fists aboard their own ships. Now, naturally, the Adeptus Mechanicus has a fair bit of medical knowledge, seeing as it is one of the many, many fields of research that they study. However, Astartes biology is very, very different from pretty much anyone else's, and Astartes biology was a well-kept secret within the Astartes chapters, partially out of long-standing tradition, and partially because you don't really want people to know how to kill you. Especially when we're talking about humans who have a nasty tendency of backstabbing each other. Just purely for the giggles occasionally. Unfortunately, however, although the Mechanicus' medical knowledge was extensive, it was not extensive enough, and the 3 Imperial Fists all perished on the operating table. In all due technicality, the Adeptus Mechanicus had just wiped out the Imperial Fists, and any records of the operation was stamped very, 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 no, I'm seriously not fucking kidding, secret. On the bright side, the Magos biologist survived. Granted, they had to switch out most of his fleshy bits with mechanical components, but he was, technically speaking, alive. This would turn out to be a rather fortuitous turn of events. You remember back in the first book when the Gravitic Storm destroyed practically the entirety of the Imperial and Navy forces above the planet of Adamantium? You remember that one cruiser who got crippled early on? Well, it so happened to have a company of Imperial Fists on board. Naturally, the shipmaster dumped the Fist down onto the planet as soon as possible, because you don't want to risk 100 Imperial Fists in a space explosion. That's just a good old-fashioned waste of killy potential right there. But just in case the situation would change, they were given a teleportation beacon, so that the ship could teleport them back up to safety if the situation in orbit stabilized before that on the surface. And said Magos biologist, being a curious little motherfucker, as all of his kind naturally are, had been tinkering with this teleportation beacon, seeing if there was any way for the people left on Adamantium to get the hell off this nasty little rock. Unfortunately, that was not possible. Now, however, the Magos biologist found himself on a ship, and he still remembered the codes for the teleportation beacon. The half-death, barely alive, and even less barely awake Magos biologist had wandered his scrawny little mechanical ass onto the teleportarum deck, entered the information for the teleport beacon into the machines, and thereby saved the Imperial Fists. Or a Imperial Fist. Kurland. Wall name, Slaughter. And from one happy news to one somewhat less happy news, back on Terra, the Officio had indeed managed to convince the High Ecclesiarch to urge Lansung, the Lord of the Imperial Navy, to gather up and dispatch reinforcements to the various threatened sectors of the Imperium. Unfortunately, this reinforcement took on a little bit of a different shape than was originally intended. Seeing an opportunity to grandstand, Langsung recalled all Imperial Navy elements from the front line to reform into a single Great Armada. This included Imperial Navy elements that was already in combat with the Orcs, which fucked over a lot of planets.
Nice.
But perhaps more importantly, one of these Imperial Navy formations was currently supporting a Black Templars crusade. As you can probably imagine, the Templars were not particularly happy to hear that their Imperial Navy elements had been recalled for no apparent reason other than for the High Lord to grandstand. Personally, I am deeply surprised that Lord Beaumont, Chapter Master of the Black Templars, didn't immediately declare a crusade oath to find and fuck Lansing to death, and then use the remains as a chapter-approved toilet brush.
Nice.
And as you can probably also imagine, the Lord of the Officio Assassinarum was also not entirely pleased with this solution, seeing as it was more focused on the Grand Admiral's glory than the needs of the Imperium. The High Ecclesiarch had, at best, delivered half a solution, and as such, the Officio delivered half of the promised antidote. It was enough to make sure that the High Ecclesiarch wouldn't die, but it was also little enough to make sure that he wasn't necessarily happy about that fact.
Nice.
And while this might all sound like good old-fashioned office politics, the consequences of Lansung's actions were rather dramatic for those whom it affected. With the Imperial Navy retreating on all fronts to gather up into one large strike force, several planets were left completely at the mercy of the Greenskins.
Yeah.
And many planets fell, and several decided to deny the invader in the most basic of ways, detonating exterminatus-level weaponry left over from the Great Heresy, and many planets even went so far as to release the Life Eater virus onto their own worlds, leaving behind little but dead, blasted, airless rocks. But, at the very least, they were Imperial rocks.
And it ended a little abruptly. But, yeah, that was pretty sweet. Quite informational. So, where should I start? Invid. So, we had orcs dropping directly into water. We had the attack moon directly affecting gravitation. We had strange warp moon effects causing typhoons. We had a Black Fist Exemplar, or we had a Fists group that was flying a Temple Fortress and ended up crashing into a planet and then being attacked by the orcs. They were able to fire the engines, which gave them advantage. And eventually the Black Templar were able to find them after a handful of the orcs were disintegrated by the sun. Disintegrated not being the proper word, evaporated. Then they had the Mechanicus had been learning about the potential of these orcs being smarter from having larger numbers of orcs and being older. That's pretty neat stuff. That's really very interesting, which may point to them being manufactured. We had the assassin leader sneak into the head guy's quarters and poison him to make him into a puppet. Yeah. And to top it all off, the Mechanicus go to the planet that we were first talking about and found 3 living fists. Kind of living. They all died on the operating table because they botched it instead of bringing them to someone who might actually be able to help them. The interpreter survived and managed to teleport just one fist to the ship. His name was Slaughter, his war name. And then, the military guy decided to make a show of pulling everybody from the front line and putting them into a large attack form. Well, when he did that, it left all sorts of people undefended. And so they took drastic matters like killing off everybody on the planet or blowing up the largest explosives they had. Essentially, they looked at what their potential means of continuing or being loyal were, and some of them, it was die and take as many orcs with you as possible. So, and it ended right there. But there's the fact that this comes from Arch Warhammers, the Beast Arises lore series. There is a link in the description to help you find Arch's channel. It's packed full of all kind of good lore stuff, and yeah, and this was requested by CJ Falcon, so pretty good stuff. That's literally, I told you everything I learned. It's getting pretty interesting, so we'll see what happens from here. Willie, out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.